Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody, and welcome to another edition of CTO Tuesdays. My name is Clive Behrman. I'm the Director of Product Marketing for Active Endpoints, and I'm here with Michael Rowley, who's the Chief Technology Officer. And today's subject, as you can see on the slide, is creating test suites for business processes. But before I begin, let's do some housekeeping rules. If you want to see and get the best experience for the webinar and presentation today, then I'd recommend that you maximize your screen to use full screen. And the webinar and presentation is being recorded today. However, you can't ask questions in person. We'll be taking questions via the questions tab in GoToWebinar, and those will be answered at the end of the session. So for those that are new to CTO Tuesdays, welcome. For those that aren't so new, welcome also. The CTO Tuesdays are a webinar, a weekly series hosted by Michael. And for those that don't know Michael, he's a leading light, if you like, to the SOA and BPM fields. He was a contributor to the BPM 2.0 spec. And he's the technical visionary behind ActiveVOS, which is obviously the BPM product delivered by Active Endpoints. As you already know, the weekly sessions are on Tuesdays, 12 p.m. Eastern and 9 p.m. Pacific. And it's really targeted towards enterprise developers, evaluators of BPM technologies, project managers, really the extended development team. As I've already said, you can register for upcoming webinars at activevos.com/CTOT, and replays of today's and other sessions are available at ctotuesdays.com. The agenda is pretty informal, so we're going to do, Michael's going to present the topic. And as I've already mentioned, there'll be some time for question and answers at the end. So let's move on to today's topic. Michael's going to describe how you're going to use business processes, how you can keep them working, and sort of, I presume, some QA sort of approaches to BPM and such like. So it should be a really interesting topic, and I'm really interested to listen and to hear more. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Michael, and it should be an interesting show.
Thank you.
Here we go.
All right. So yes, this week I'm going to be covering testing of business processes. Creating a test suite for a business process is, I think, something that's not covered nearly enough in topics when people are considering business process management, business process optimization, collaborating with non-business users. But some of the more traditional development activities, like testing, very infrequently come up, and I think that's a problem. So first, I'm going to be covering that as the first thing. Why should we test business processes? I'll go into some of the different styles of testing, Blackbox and whitebox testing. I'm going to have more in this topic, in this talk than normal. I'm going to be doing some how-tos, how you actually accomplish this kind of testing, and I'll naturally be using the ActiveVOS product to show that. And then at the end, I'll be showing some testing best practices. So first, why should you test a business process? First of all, what is an executable business process? Well, it's a collection of activities, some of which are performed by people, others by systems, that are organized into a control flow. In other words, it's a program. It runs. It's something that tells the computer what to do, and it runs. So it's a program. And as such, programs need to be tested. So you can be sure that it'll work before you start betting your business on it. You want to make sure that when you pass input documents to an automated service or even to a form-based task, that you've constructed it correctly, that any place in the process where you've got conditions, like on looping or on branching, that you've created the conditions correctly or the transformations correctly. You need to be able to make sure that any complex control flow, these are things like fault handlers, message handlers, alarm handlers, compensation logic, that sort of stuff. It's one thing to drop a bunch of icons onto your screen. It's another thing to get it right so that it actually does what you wanted it to do. And of course, the tests mix real and fake. There's the thing tested and the things not tested. So the real is what's being tested, which is all of the process logic should be tested. But the fake is the use of services and people. You don't really want to use the accounting service. You don't really want to use the accountant. You want to just mimic those roles while you're testing your business logic. And then once you've got a process running, you're not done with testing. Tests should be run whenever you further change the process. You should have regression tests, which are a suite of tests that test everything that you believe is working with your process, so that when you go in and change it, the things that used to work still should work, unless a change purposefully is designed to change a test result. So when you go into a business process, you should say, okay, I'm going to make a change to my business process, run my test suite, and there probably will be some failures, but you should be able to look at those failures and say, oh yeah, those are failures that figure into the fact that they were testing that it does something it no longer does, or that it doesn't do something that it does do, that sort of thing. So let me look at black box testing. So that B request shouldn't be there yet. I got there a little early on my animation. So first pass in a request for a service. Processes offer services. And then when the response comes back, you say, okay, is this response what I expected it to be? You have no idea what's going on inside the process. All you care is you sent in A, you got back its response, you checked that it was right. You sent in B's request, and then when it responds, you check it out. As far as you're concerned, you have no clue what's going on in the process. That is a very useful form of testing, but not the only form of testing. This is especially useful to get some tests that you would expect not to change as much, not to fail as much when you make changes to your process. But there's also white box testing, where you can actually now in the test framework essentially can see into the box that has the process. And in this one, you're sending a request and you kind of know where it's going to the specific receive that it's heading toward. You also know that there's things that are going to happen in the process, and you want to test that they do happen inside the process. So like this call to A is going to be implemented by calling both Y and X. So you'll see that Y happened, and you'll check the fact that it did. Yes, it did. Then you'll send in this little white document here is the fake response for the call to Y. Then there's going to be a call out to X. Again, you're going to check the fact, you're going to note that the call out was made. Not only that it was made, but that it was made with the right kind of request document in it. So you check that out. Then give a fake response. And then ultimately the process will give a response to the original request, which you'll then check its content to make sure it has the right values. And then again, you get another request. This time you're checking the Z and that it's made properly, and you're providing some fake response, and then that the B responds correctly. So this is white box testing. Both of them are useful. These, as you might guess, tends to be more fragile. As you work with your process, it might get some different results, and so you'll have to update your tests more frequently. So now let's go into the creation, how you go about creating these tests. Just a quick overview. We make it possible to create tests by simulating processes, simulating a single run of a process using fake data. This is or it could be real data, but from fake services. So where instead of calling real services and real humans, it's provided with sample data. Then when you get a simulation run you like, you save it as a bUnit test. It creates assertions that says everything should be exactly like this test run. But you should go in and relax the assertions so they make more sense. I'll get into more detail on that later. You can convert the kind of test that is generated automatically as a whitebox test. You can convert it to a Blackbox test. You should then add for things that you wouldn't have put into simulation, like alarms, faults, message handling, and then you can create entire suites. So let me go into that in more detail. First, test preparation. In the test preparation, you have to get prepared to simulate a process. And for simulating, you come up with the data that should be used for the responses to the request. So let me flip. I'm going to be flipping a lot to to our design environment. This is a loan process. I'll be using this loan process. Not a really complicated process, but it should suffice for the sort of thing I want to do today. When you kick this thing off, it needs data. In fact, this one I've got all set up with data. I'm going to flip over to one that doesn't have data so you can see what happens if you have no data. If you have no data and you say, I'd like this one to be simulated, it'll start the debug environment. You see the view switched to a debugging view. And then the very first activity in the process is a receiving the loan application. It knows it has no sample data for that. And it says, oh, what kind of sample data should I use? And it goes and finds all of the sample data that it knows about that is of the right type. So you go in and request, you choose one. Then you can step through this process. This is an assignment, which means it's entirely internal to the process. It doesn't need any fake data. It's really computing something. That should be able to work in its entirety. This assessment of the risk, I'm going to step over this whole thing. It is calling out to an external service. That external service needs to respond, and how it responds is unknown, so we have to pick fake data. So I'll say low, and then I can continue. I can just say go to go out to the end. So this thing runs the process, and now from there on, if I run it again, if I clear the state and say, okay, now run this thing again, it will not ask me again because it's got the data associated with the various variables. Let me. This is important, especially for the creation of tests. So I'm going to go into more detail. I'm going to do it with this process. There are a number of different ways that you can add sample data. One of the most valuable, I'd say, is the way I just showed was obviously the easiest because you don't have to think very hard. It asks you and you tell it. But in order to get a nice suite of tests, you're going to want to have lots of different combinations of inputs. And so you'll want to be able to very quickly choose between valid inputs. So the way you can do that is you can associate some sample data with the requests by registering multiple samples. So this is this assess risk. This is the risk assessment service. The risk assessment service has the inputs and outputs. The inputs doesn't need any simulation because we're providing the inputs. The output does need simulation, and we're going to be testing a variety of different paths. And I basically have 3 different paths that are going to be tested based on the output of this thing. So I'm going to want to have 3 different kinds of data. And I could go into one of these and see what it looks like. It's just an XML document that is the kind of document that you expect from that service. If I already have documents laying around, I can go and add them, say add sample, and find the sample and say, use that one. If I don't have samples, I can say generate a sample, and it'll generate something with approval declined, say 3, where it kind of fills in enough about it that you can fill in the rest of the data later, right? It gave one possible value, and you can go in and fix it to give other values. So that's where you get all this sample data from. Then the next place you can put that, the first of those will be the default. That's the one that will be used if you don't say otherwise. But this sample data gets associated with the WSDL, with the web service itself. So if you've got a bunch of different processes that all use this same service, they'll all get that same set of registered samples, which can be really useful. But if you want to specify for this process specifically, I want certain kinds of data. Well, I'll stick with risk assessment. You can double-click it to open it, go in and say, load data from registered samples. And this is where it gives you the list of samples to choose. You click on one, and then you go with it. That gives you the ability to quickly choose the different paths, right? So I now can see I've got, well, actually, I already tested the low path. I can go and let me go for a different path, say a review path. If I do that path and then test it, it'll go up and across the top. Now, I'm getting all these different ways of testing the different paths. I haven't yet talked about how I create bUnit tests. So the next thing is that I can, anytime you've completed a simulation, it stores all of the choices that were made for the inputs to the various services that were called. Let's see. No, that would be outputs. If you call to a service, it'll store the outputs. Basically, everything that comes into the process is stored, as well as everything that went out of the process. What went out of the process is stored as assertions, and I'll show you that in a second. Loan process 2. I don't want to overwrite anything. So this is going to store what's called what we call a bUnit. bUnit for like a business process unit test. This has a bunch of interesting characteristics. It's got some basic definitions up front. It's got a series of invokes, a series of extension activities, which are usually the people activities, and a series of commands. The commands are what drives the thing from the outside that don't require prompting. That's like, do these things. Everything else in here is reaction. So this starts with the sending of a message. And what it does is it sends a loan process request. This was one of the things that was chosen as sample data, the sample data that kicks the whole thing off. And then all it does is, at some point, if you remember, look at the process here. At some point, there will be an answer to that thing. This was the request. This was the answer to that request, and it'll reply under review. So it got a real XML document as output. So the way that's represented is this is what got passed in, and then we've got an assert equals that says, and the result should look exactly like this under review. Okay? Now, but in order to get to that result, you had to have done a bunch of simulation. That's where things like the invokes come in. So for the invoke, this is the place where every time, remember how in that animation, something went out and it was checked, and then something fake came back? The thing that went out is represented here. It says, there should be a call to assess risk. There should be one of them called in this process. And when it is called, the input that is sent to the service should look like this, exactly. And then, so that's where the check is. Then there will be a simulated response. And the simulated response we provided during our simulation looked like this. That got us through that activity, this invoke. It was checked that the same thing happened as during the simulation, and then provided some fake result. The fake result caused it to come all the way here to review loan. So let's go look at the unit test. The unit test says at some point there's going to be an extension activity that is a people activity. There should be one of them. And it's going to have, you're going to assert that there is a task that looks like this, and that the input to the task looks like this, and then you get the fake answer back here. You know, this is that's provided. And then that's basically it. This was all generated from running that test. So, as you might be able to tell, what just got generated is a white box test that's very fragile. Very fragile because you the answer is real specific. So, say for example, this document. If it said, if it didn't exactly say declined, unfortunately you don't qualify, and your score is 320. If it doesn't say everything exactly like that, it'll fail the test. But in fact, most of those things you don't really care about. Most of those things you would say it doesn't matter in order for it to qualify as a successful test. So, and there's very little we can do to know in advance what is going to be a successful test. But I can tell you that there's some assertions that you can do. Say with this assertion of the assess risk, say, you can, instead of asserting the entire document has to look exactly like this, what you can do is you can say, let's pick a piece. Let's look at this whole thing and say, well, all I really care about in this is that at this point we should know that it's an auto loan. So let's pull that piece out. We'll go to the query builder and we'll say, here's the document I care about. Give me a little more room. Loan type is what I care about. Now so I'm going to narrow it down to just that loan type element. The loan type, we have to still be valid XML. So I'm going to do a quick cut of the the namespace declaration. Say, this ought to be a loan type with that as its namespace, with the value of auto, and then I don't care about everything else. Okay. Now it's starting to get to be a little bit more of a reusable test that will continue to work even as I make changes to the process. To actually run the process, and actually you might not want to just run the process, but you might want to actually debug the process because, or debug the test, because if it doesn't work out, you want to figure out why. So over here you've got this little debug symbol that says run the entire test, and if at the same time run it in the debugger, so if there are any breaks, you can walk through it slowly. So I don't think I have any breakpoints on my process, so it's going to just go straight through, and then work. Yeah. All right. So there are no. Oh, here we go. Validating the bUnit test file. 9 mappings. Okay. What it's doing here in the console, you can see that it's deploying the process to an engine that's actually inside the Eclipse environment. You can see now it's actually executing the test, and it got the entire thing and worked. It worked because, sure enough, the thing really is an auto loan. If I said it has to be a home loan here, and then I tried rerunning the test, say rerun the test, then something about either my tests or my process must be wrong because I've got an assertion that fails. It'll redeploy the process and execute it as a test. And let's find out what happens with that. So it just finish the deployment, validate it in the bUnit file. When you do make a change to the bUnit file, it does need to do a few things. If you're rerunning something that already exists, it tends to be very fast. So you can see we've got an error that it didn't succeed. We've got an assertion failure that the XML element didn't match what was intended. So this is where you start to debug why didn't my assertion match what I expected. So let me put that back to auto so that if I should run this in the future, it will still work. Let me now flip back to my slides. So we saw the various ways of providing variable samples. I do want to do a quick overview of the things, the different levels that you can get for providing samples. There's the data you can specify data on an individual activity to override things specified on the process level variable if you do it more than once. There's the process level variable, which is the next place where you can have it, which overrides what's done for the service in general. And then there's the one done for the service. Okay. Debugging. Now, black box versus white box testing. So how do you do black box testing? How do you get it so that it doesn't care about what happened inside? So let me take a look at this test. If I have this test, we know that if it's black box, this send message has to send in the right thing and get the right thing back, or at least to some representation of what should be done. You still need to have you still need to have some invokes inside. You need to have these elements which says, if I should happen to run into an invoke, give me some data so I can keep going. But what we can do is this count is an assertion. It says it has to happen exactly one time. If I just get rid of that, I say, I don't care how many times it happens. And then if I go into the assertions and I say, I don't actually need to assert anything is true because I don't care. This is considered internal. And here I can get rid of that assertion. And for the people activity, I can get rid of that assertion. So basically, all of the things inside, where I was looking inside the process, you remove them as assertions, but you keep the simulated responses. And you also get rid of all of the places where you've got a count. So this is saying only test the results of the service to the ultimate client. Provide data for anything that should happen to be called, but pay no attention to whether it gets called or not. And if it does get called, pay no attention to what kind of data is used, because it's considered a black box. And then this is a test. When you go into this style, it is much more likely, as you can guess, because it's got removed most of its assertions, much more likely to pass. But so you should have those tests kind of set aside and saying, these are the things that, if those go wrong, something's really bad. White box one, it just means I probably need to jigger with it. So that's, I'm not actually going to save that. I don't feel like running that test. So that's how you get to the black box testing. You should also consider testing additional capabilities that you don't get through simulation. You can send asynchronous messages. You can simulate alarms. You can simulate faults and how they're handled. This is all done through things like you can add alarms within an invoke. You can add, you can add more invokes for a specific invoke. You can add a new iteration so that each iteration is handled slightly differently. You can also specify for the commands, you can add new send messages so that it'll ask for status partway through, or it'll cancel something partway through. You can also get faults generated. There's just a wide variety of things that you should consider testing. The next thing is to then run multiple tests as suites, and then you run those suites as potentially as ant scripts. So the way you add things as suites is you just select a set of unit tests. Let's say new B suite test suite, and so I'm going to say test suite 2. That's obviously a pretty simple concept. When you run a test suite, what it'll do is it'll take all these unit tests that are part of the suite, and it'll run them one at a time and give you a final report at the end of it to tell you how you're doing. And then, then there's also the creation of the ant script. If you want to do this as an ant script, you're actually, why don't I wait just a minute, and you can see after it validates the one that I changed. It's going to start going through and running these things. That one worked. This one worked, or is working. That one worked, and this one worked. So we got all of the tests worked. If one of them didn't work, you'd be able to drill into it and see which test failed and why. If you want to turn it into an Ant script so that you can run it offline outside of the development environment, you just say new bUnit Ant script, and it'll save the thing as an Ant script. And one nice thing of doing it that way is then you can go in and play with the Ant script yourself. It's a pretty straightforward Ant script to fix things up and do other tests if you should so desire. So last thing before we go, testing best practices. Create assertions that test only for what must be true in order for a process to be correct. Create black box tests, which continue to work even if the process behind them changes and the activities changes the activities that are called. Also create whitebox tests to make sure what you think should happen, the right activities are called in different cases, and be willing to have to change those as the process changes. And then also try to test all the paths through the process, including different examples of handlers that might need to be triggered, event handlers, fault handlers, that sort of thing, even though it really isn't possible to test all possible handler execution times, because there's basically a close to infinite variety of times that they can have happen. So that's about testing business processes. Clyde?
Fantastic. And we have a couple of questions that came through, so some good questions. So would you recommend, if you were going to run the Ant scripts, would you put them in a CVS repository or something like that?
Yeah.
So if if there's a separation of duties between the folks that are developing and those that are testing, could you explain some best practices for that? So like Ant scripts, would you put those in CVS repository?
Yeah. What I'm showing now, the little greater than signs mean that it's not checked in.
Okay.
The one that doesn't have a greater than sign and the little green, that's actually the same one as I've got checked in, because other people at Active Endpoints use some of these same tests. So the integration of Eclipse with any source code repository, in this case CVS, makes it very easy to do things like revert it to base, check it in, update it, commit it, synchronize with the repository, etc. So it's really useful.
Let's see. Take another one. Oh, you mentioned compensation logic at the beginning. Mm-hmm. What's the difference between compensation logic and just logic?
Right. So compensation logic is when you've gotten a test. Let's see. A business process runs partway through. The classic example of compensation is reservations. You've gotten a reservation for a hotel, reservation for a car. You go to get a reservation for a flight and you can't get it. That throws a fault. The fault handler says, oh, go back and undo the things that already completed, compensate them, because you couldn't get all three. And then it goes, the compensation logic is explicit process logic that hangs off of those previous activities that says, if this completes successfully, like getting a car reservation, and it needs to be undone because of something later failed, do this. And the do this is cancel the reservation. And so you need to be able to test those canceling.
Okay. There was another question that said, what's the difference between just developing the process and going through the steps? Do you do some of this testing anyway as you're developing?
I certainly recommend it. So typically you will you'll be dragging activities onto your display, and the first time you think you have the logic there to get the thing to run, the first thing you do is simulate. And once you've simulated, you might as well save that as a bUnit test, right? So if you're early on, You don't want to create a lot of fragile tests. It's more like, so I think I'll take back that you might as well save it as a bUnit test. It's more like once you've gotten it to a state where you say, I think this does what I always planned it to do, then you create a bUnit test for it. There are, people do sometimes like to do test first development. In that case, you certainly can create these bUnit tests from scratch. You can start, instead of, I showed a technique where you start with generating a fairly fragile test and you delete a bunch of things to turn it into a black box test. You could, right at the very beginning, like when all you've got is the request and replies, generate the skeleton of a black box test. You put in your assertions that you're going to care about, and only then create your process. And every once in a while, when you think you've achieved what you were planning on, you run your black box tests and see if they did what you hoped they would do.
Okay. And then finally, one last question. You have your development environment and you have your production environment. Presumably, it's the same tests on both, or should you run all of your sort of tests in QA, and then as you roll it out, you know, how do you test your production?
Well, that's a good question. It's one of the reasons why we created the ability to have Ant scripts that do the tests, right? Because the style of a developer running these tests work really well for these specialized debug environments that run the tests. But as you're moving processes around and moving schemas and WSDL definitions and moving things from development to production, you want to sanity test it. Everything that worked in the development server should continue to work on the deployment server. So running them as an Ant script before you like flip the switch to have them go live is a great idea. And it's kind of a different scenario. It's the same tests, but used for a different purpose.
Okay, thanks very much. So I'm fresh out of questions here, and let me I think we'll wrap up. So Michael, thanks very much for doing another stellar job.
Thank you.
We're going to, again, have another CTO Tuesday, but it won't be next Tuesday this time. So our next up-and-coming webinar, apart from the weekly introduction to ActiveVOS, which is tomorrow, but we've got a special coming up on Thursday the 18th, which is Fast Track Your BPM Projects, Tools and Techniques for IT. So that one's going to involve renowned BPM analyst Sandy Kensley and our own Michael Raleigh here. So register for that. There's a special URL, so you can see that that GoToMeeting URL there. As I mentioned in the introduction, the download and replays are available on the blog at CTO Tuesday. If you want to subscribe via RSS, there's an RSS feed for that, so you can set that up in your favorite RSS reader. The replays are also on iTunes, so if you search for VOS Abilities on iTunes, you'll get to see the podcast there straight to your down to your iPhone or your iPod. And of course, if you ever want to try any of this stuff, I think I'm going to go and give that JUnit or bUnit stuff a try. Then you can go to ActiveVOS and register and download and use ActiveVOS for free. As always, if there's any questions or comments, send them to me, and I'll pass them on to Michael. And if there's a general question about CTO Tuesdays, then feel free to email at ctot@activevos.com. So if you enjoyed the presentation today, my name's Clive Behrman, and if you didn't enjoy it, my name is Michael Raleigh. So, so thanks very much, everybody, and see you at the next webinar.